No one laughed at the galaxy's apex predators until they saw the human. It began the way most galactic encounters did, with silence pretending to be diplomacy. A silence so controlled it felt engineered, as if the universe itself had been told to hold its breath. The war chamber aboard the Carthrex Dreadspire drifted in a slow, deliberate orbit above a dying star, its light bent into impossible geometries across the obsidian walls. Every surface shimmered with embedded intelligence, living metal that listened, learned, and judged. This was not a place built for conversation. It was a place where civilizations came to be measured, and usually found lacking. Then the human arrived, not through ceremony, not through grand announcement. There was no choir of translation drones, no heralding pulse of gravity bells. The arrival was almost insulting in its simplicity. A single, pressure door unlocking, a narrow corridor of cold air, and a figure stepping into the vast chamber as though it were just another room that happened to be too large. He was small, intentionally so, in a way that made the eyes of the gathered warlords struggle to reconcile perception with instinct. Among the Carthrex, among the Veil Speakers and the bone-forged Hadron Sentinels, size was authority, mass was history, presence was survival written into flesh. And yet this human, Commander Elias Venn, carried none of it in the way the galaxy understood. Still, he did not hesitate. The chamber registered him immediately. Scanners swept him in layers of invisible judgment, thermal fragility, skeletal density, neural volatility. Every result screamed the same conclusion: insufficient, breakable, temporary, the kind of organism that should have been filtered out by evolution long before it learned to look upward at the stars. A ripple of amusement passed through the assembly, subtle but unmistakable. Not laughter yet, not openly, but the beginning of it, the way predators acknowledge something they do not yet need to respect. Above him, suspended in armored thrones of light and gravity, the Dominion's War Council watched. Some leaned forward. Some did not bother hiding their disdain. One of them, a vast Carthrex general with layered mandibles and a crown of adaptive bone, tilted its head as if observing a malfunctioning construct. The human stopped at the center mark of the chamber, a circle designed for supplicants, a place where lesser species stood when they understood at last their place in the hierarchy. He did not look down. That was the first fracture in expectation. No trembling hands, no lowered gaze, no instinctive submission to scale or presence. Instead, his eyes lifted, calm, precise, and unsettlingly aware, as if he were not the one being evaluated, but the one quietly evaluating everything in return. The ambient pressure of the chamber seemed to tighten, as though the structure itself disliked being observed back. Somewhere in the upper tiers, a translated whisper flickered across the collective feed. "Is this the envoy?" Another reply. Sharper. "That is the human." A pause followed. Brief, almost imperceptible. But in that pause, something ancient and instinctive stirred across multiple species at once. Not fear, not yet. Something older. Recognition, without understanding. Because the galaxy had learned how to laugh at many things, but it had not yet decided whether this one was allowed to be laughed at all. The Dominion of Carthrex did not conquer space. It curated it. From the outside, it looked like an empire. From within, it was something colder, a perfected hierarchy of engineered inevitability. 12 spiral arms of the galaxy bent inward toward its will, not through chaos or brute expansion, but through precision so absolute it felt like law. Entire civilizations did not fall, they were reclassified. Some became client worlds, some became resource systems, and some simply stopped appearing in maps after their usefulness expired. Varellus Prime was the Dominion's crown thought made physical. It floated inside a nebula that glittered like broken glass suspended in eternal slow motion, each shard of light refracting the distant death of stars that had been harvested to fuel its systems. The capital world was not built on a planet in the traditional sense. It was anchored to layered orbital continents, vast plates of engineered gravity stitched together by beams of condensed spacetime. Storms of ionized dust circled beneath, it like obedient ghosts. The sky was not blue, it was measured. Inside its highest chamber, the War Summit Hall, reality itself felt curated. The architecture defied geometry. Walls curved in directions that suggested the universe had been rewritten for aesthetic superiority. Every surface was alive with silent intelligence, living alloy that recorded every word, every pulse of intent, every micro-expression of dominance or submission. Nothing in the room was passive. Even the air carried sensors whispering data into unseen war minds that calculated outcomes before decisions were even spoken. This was where Commander Elias Venn stood, the first human envoy ever granted audience, with the Dominion. He looked impossibly out of place. Around him rose the assembled apexes of conquered evolution. A crystalline strategist from the Veil Spires refracted light through its body like a living equation. A hadron warform, grown, in gravity wells and hardened by neutron storms, stood motionless, its musculature layered like collapsing stars. The Carthrex themselves dominated the upper tiers, towering insectoid intellects encased in adaptive bone armor, each movement slow, deliberate, and absolutely certain. They were not gathered to negotiate. They were gathered to evaluate whether negotiation was still a valid concept. Elias felt it in the pressure of the room, the subtle psychological compression used by Dominion chambers to destabilize lesser species. It pressed against the mind like a hand tightening around thought itself. Many species broke within seconds of exposure. Some forgot why they had come. Others began speaking an apology before they even realized they were speaking. But Elias did not. He carried Earth in his memory like an anchor. Storms over ocean continents, cities that lit up the night like constellations made by hand, a species that learned fire before it learned forgiveness. Compared to this chamber, Earth was small, fragile, statistically irrelevant, and yet it had sent him. The Dominion's representatives did not speak at first. They studied him the way predators study unfamiliar movement in tall grass, not with panic, but with calculation. The Carthrex general at the highest tier tilted slightly forward, mandibles clicking in a rhythm that translated across systems as mild amusement. Below it, holographic projections bloomed into existence. Humanity's star cluster, its defenses, its ships, thin, fast, inefficient by Dominion standards, its orbital platforms, fragile rings of metal and hope. Its communications grid, redundant, decentralized, stubbornly alive. The chamber allowed a sound to pass through it now, not laughter yet, something more precise. Assessment becoming dismissal. Elias remained still, eyes reflecting the shifting blue, light of collapsing projections. Somewhere deep in the hall, the Dominion's war minds began calculating the end of his species, not as a threat assessment, but as a scheduling note. And the galaxy, in its most powerful throne room, prepared to decide when humanity would stop existing. The negotiations did not fail with shouting. They failed with certainty. It began when the first translated sentence finished echoing through the War Summit Hall, and no one bothered to respond as if it deserved one. Instead, the Dominion's attention shifted, not toward debate, but toward conclusion. Vast minds that had crushed empires in measured increments simply stopped considering humanity as a variable requiring dialogue. The crystalline strategist was the first to project its verdict. A lattice of light unfolded above the chamber floor, mapping human space in fractal precision. It did not hesitate. It did not soften its conclusion for diplomacy. It rendered Earth's cluster in sterile probability matrices, each line of data, stripping away illusion until only inevitability remained. Humanity. Statistical anomaly. The phrase repeated across the chamber in dozens of dialects, each translation colder than the last. Not insult, not fear, just classification. The kind of label applied to radiation leaks or dying stars, something that is observed, contained, and eventually corrected. The Hadron Warform shifted its weight. The sound of its movement was like tectonic plates grinding beneath a thin crust. It leaned toward the human envoy, not to threaten him, but to measure him more efficiently up close. Its optical receptors dilated and contracted in slow, mechanical curiosity. "You persist," it transmitted, its voice filtered through translated resonance fields. "Despite knowing your density threshold is insufficient for interstellar conflict. Survival." Elias Venn did not answer immediately. He felt the room pressing inward, not physically but cognitively. The Dominion's environment was designed for dominance through perception. Even silence here was weaponized. Every pause suggested weakness. Every breath suggested exposure. Yet beneath the weight of alien scrutiny, Elias held something no scan could quantify. Intent that refused to be reduced. Above him, the Carthrex general finally spoke. "You call yourselves predators," it said, mandibles clicking with deliberate rhythm, each sound resonating through layered translation fields. "Yet your species has not yet completed its first cycle of galactic attrition." A pause. A slow tilt of its armored head. "You are not prey. Prey understands the rules of being hunted." The chamber reacted subtly to that distinction, like a shared internal correction across thousands of minds. Even among apex species, there was recognition of hierarchy and classification. Humanity had slipped beneath even the category of prey. That realization alone shifted the atmosphere of all the holograms changed. Now they displayed not fleets, but vulnerabilities, orbital weaknesses, supply dependencies, psychological profiles of human decision-making under extinction pressure. Every element of humanity was dissected and reassembled into exploitability metrics. The Dominion did not debate whether humanity could survive. It began designing the most efficient way to ensure it did not. And still, no one looked at Elias as a participant in that future, only as a delay. The laughter started quietly this time. Not loud, not crude. A ripple of amusement passed through the upper tiers of the chamber, controlled, almost polite. The kind of laughter that does not mock strength, but acknowledges irrelevance. A veil speaker tilted its head, light fracturing, across its crystalline skull. "Primitive systems," it transmitted softly, almost kindly, "often mistake persistence for relevance." That was when Elias finally spoke. Not in anger, not in protest, but in something far more unsettling to the gathered minds. Clarity. "You're not evaluating us," he said. A pause. "You're already deciding how to clean up after us." The words landed in the chamber like a misaligned code string, briefly, disrupting predictive models that had already finished calculating human extinction timelines. For the first time since his arrival, several Dominion entities recalibrated their attention toward him directly, not as an anomaly, but as an uncertainty, and in a room built entirely to eliminate uncertainty, that was the first real fracture. The chamber did not register the arrival at first, not as an event, not as a breach, not even as an anomaly. It registered as a corruption of expectation, a moment where every predictive model across the War Summit Hall stalled simultaneously, like a machine encountering a concept it had never been designed to translate. Then, the gravity changed. Subtle at first, a fractional distortion in the weight of presence. Suspended light along the chamber walls bent inward, not toward a focal point, but toward absence, as if reality itself was being pulled into alignment with something larger than structure. The living metal of the hall, which had never failed to anticipate motion, hesitated. Its intelligence, ancient, arrogant, absolute, paused as if suddenly unsure of its own senses. The doors did not open. They ceased to matter. Where sealed adamantium thresholds had stood, there was now a vertical tear in perception, an outline of space that refused to commit to geometry. Beyond it, something moved, Not stepping, not entering. Simply becoming present in a way that made the distinction irrelevant. The first thing the Dominion war minds attempted was classification. Size, undefined. Mass, inconsistent. Energy signature, recursive. Identity, non-local. The second attempt was fear, an emergent response buried so deep in evolutionary code that even apex species rarely acknowledged its existence. It rose across the chamber in staggered waves as the entity resolved itself into form. The Kyle rune arrived like a thought too large for the mind that thought it. Its silhouette was not stable. Armor, if it could be called that, shifted between states of matter, folding through visible and invisible spectra as though reality was experimenting with how much of it could be witnessed without collapse. Fractal lines of pale light traced across its surface, not as decoration, but as language written in physics itself. Even the Carthrex, who had conquered 11 species that fed on gravity wells and neutron storms, did not move. They simply recalculated existence. The Kyle rune did not look at them. Not at first. Its attention passed over the assembled Dominion like wind over abandoned ruins. Empires that had believed themselves apex suddenly felt what it meant to be terrain. Something that exists beneath notice not because it is insignificant, but because it is already accounted for. And then it stopped. On Elias Venn. The human stood still at the center of the chamber, dwarfed by civilizations, surrounded by extinction-grade intellects, and yet in that moment, he was the only fixed point in a universe that had begun to drift. The Kale rune tilted its head. The motion was not curiosity, it was recognition. A silence expanded, so total it felt engineered. Even the war minds stopped transmitting. Even the living metal forgot to record. The Dominion, for the first time in its recorded history, had no response prepared. Then the Kale rune spoke. Its voice did not travel through air. It arrived directly, in comprehension, bypassing language entirely, translating itself into meaning before thought could resist it. Little brother. The words landed like a gravitational collapse. Somewhere in the upper tiers, a Carthrex general attempted to trigger defensive protocols the command never completed, not interrupted, preempted, as if the concept of defense had already been resolved elsewhere in time. The Kale rune's gaze remained on Elias. You took long enough to answer the call, and in that instant, the Dominion understood something. It had never been built to comprehend. Humanity was not alone in the equation. It had never been alone. And whatever stood before them now was not an ally arriving late to the war, but a family returning to see what had been done in its absence. The silence after the Kale rune's words did not end. It fractured. It broke into layers of realization that hit different minds at different speeds. Some understood immediately. Others resisted understanding until resistance itself became physically painful. Across the War Summit Hall, Apex intelligences recalculated everything they believed to be fundamental about dominance, survival, and hierarchy, and all of them arrived at the same conclusion. Nothing they had built their power on was designed to survive this moment. Elias Venn felt it first as pressure lifting, like a planetary gravity field being quietly rewritten. The oppressive weight that had pinned his thoughts since arrival did not vanish, but it shifted direction. The chamber was no longer compressing him. It was listening, not to his authority, but to his species. As if humanity had suddenly been moved from subject to variable to something far more dangerous. A reference point. The Kale rune stepped forward. Each movement did not displace air, it negotiated with it. Reality bent around its presence in controlled distortions, like space itself had learned respect. It stopped beside Elias, towering not in size alone, but in the weight of accumulated histories that clung to it like invisible armor. Then it spoke. Again, not to the Dominion, but through them, letting its voice rewrite the chamber's comprehension fields. You misjudge them, it said, a simple statement. A universe-ending correction. The Carthrex general attempted to respond. Its mandibles clicked in a sequence that had commanded planetary invasions. Entire species had fallen to those commands. But this time, the sound dissolved before translation could complete. The command structures in the chamber no longer recognized it as valid authority. The Kale rune continued, as all predators do, before they meet something that refuses to stay prey. That word, prey, collapsed across the chamber like a broken axis. Every species present felt it differently. For some it was insult. For others, revelation. For the Dominion war minds, it was error, an impossible reclassification that refused to stabilize. Elias exhaled slowly. He did not fully understand what the Kale rune was. But he understood the shift, the dangerous kind of shift, the kind that happens when the rules of a system are not broken but revealed to have been temporary all along. The Kale rune extended its hand, not toward Elias as command, not toward the Dominion as threat, but outward, into the shared space of observation itself. And something unfolded. Not a weapon, not a shield. A record. Light spilled from its palm in recursive patterns, each layer revealing a different historical thread. Battles fought in silence between stars. Civilizations that never made contact lists because they ended before naming themselves. Species that had once stood where the Dominion now stood, and made the same mistake. The projection did not show destruction, it showed pattern. Elias saw it too, instantly, instinctively. Humanity was not an isolated anomaly in the Kale rune's record. It was part of a recurring outcome, a variation that appeared whenever certain conditions aligned. Expansion without comprehension, dominance without humility, intelligence without restraint. The Kale rune's voice lowered, and for the first time, it carried something almost personal. "We did not arrive to save you," it said. A pause. "We arrived because you finally became visible to what hunts systems, not species." The Dominion chambers tried to respond with suppression. Protocols, they failed, tried recalibration, failed again, tried silence, and discovered silence no longer belonged to them. Elias looked around the hall, the apex predators, the war gods, the engineered dominions of forgotten sectors, and saw for the first time something beneath all their power. Uncertainty without control. And in that uncertainty, humanity was no longer the smallest thing in the room. It was the only thing that still remembered how to stand in a universe that had just changed its rules. The battle did not begin with fire. It began with understanding. Across the dominions, war grid, alarms never had the chance to scream. Not because they were silenced, but because they were rendered obsolete before activation. Entire defense protocols unfolded in perfect sequence, only to discover they were responding to events that had already been resolved elsewhere. The galaxy's most advanced war machine, engineered to anticipate probability itself, found itself reacting to outcomes that no longer existed. Outside Varellus Prime, the human fleet moved, not in chaos, not in desperation, in synchronization, so absolute it felt like a single organism breathing across light years. Every ship that the Dominion had dismissed as fragile was suddenly something else entirely. Not larger, not stronger, but coordinated beyond visibility. What looked like scattered formation was, in truth, a distributed intelligence network operating on principles the Dominion had never bothered to study, because they had never believed. The weak were capable of inventing systems the strong could not predict. Elias Venn stood in the Kale rune's presence as the war unfolded beyond the chamber's walls. He did not issue commands in the way the Dominion understood them. He didn't need to. Humanity's command structure had never been centralized. It had been redundant, layered in trust networks, split across minds that learned to think in parallel rather than hierarchy. When one node moved, it did not instruct others. It inspired inevitability. Decisions propagated not as orders, but as consensus formed under pressure faster than language could carry it. The Kale rune watched the Dominion's confusion with something that resembled disappointment. "They still think strength is something you display," it said quietly. A flicker of motion outside the chamber caught Elias's attention. On the holographic projections still streaming fractured battlefield data, Dominion fleets attempted countermeasures. Massive war spheres rotated into position. Energy lattices formed around Virelis Prime like cages designed to contain a species that no longer operated inside cages. And yet, every formation was already compromised before it completed alignment. Humanity did not meet the Dominion head-on. It stepped around it. Supply lines collapsed not through destruction, but through misdirection so precise it felt like inevitability had been edited. Communication arrays didn't fail. They began transmitting signals that led nowhere the Dominion could act upon. Entire fleets found themselves guarding empty coordinates, convinced they were in the right place because all indicators insisted they were. The Calrune extended its awareness outward, amplifying what Elias could only perceive in fragments, and then he saw it fully. Humanity had not built a war machine. It had built a system that made domination inefficient. The Dominion's greatest strength, centralized command, became its weakness the moment it encountered a species that did not rely on single points of failure. Every attempt to strike a human core hit distributed echoes. Every attempt to sever leadership struck a network that had already adapted to loss before it occurred. The battlefield was not shifting. It was pre-decided, not by prediction, by design. Inside the War Summit Hall, the Carthrex general finally moved again. Slowly, not toward command, not toward retaliation, but toward recognition of something it had never evolved to process, a war where winning conditions were not defined by force, but by understanding too late. Elias felt it then, not victory in the human sense, but alignment. Like pieces of a larger machine finally acknowledging they were part of something older than conquest. The Calrune spoke one last time, its voice softer now, almost reverent in its final weight. "This is why we call you little brother." A pause. "Not because you are small." The projection outside flared as another Dominion fleet went silent, not destroyed, simply reassigned out of relevance. "But because you are the only ones who learned how to survive what comes after being underestimated." And in that moment, as galaxies shifted without noise and empires failed without collapse, humanity did not roar. It simply continued. And that was enough to change everything.